focusing on, this is the church history we're doing since 1991.
Mm-hmm.
And you really played an important part in that. So could you talk about the early relationship you had with First Church? You know, first off, what was your introduction to First Church and how did that go? Who were you working with?
Mm-hmm.
Sort of thing.
I first ended up going to First Church because a girlfriend brought me there, a woman who had grown up UU on the East Coast,
Mm-hmm.
and I was working with her at the wilderness therapy program out in Utah, and so she brought me there, and I think the first time I was there, Tom was preaching about Thoreau, and I was like, wow, this is my kind of place. And so I felt a strong connection there right away. And then when I went back to school then a year or so later, I started getting more involved with the environmental ministry there, and some of the book groups. I remember in particular the Plan B 3.0 book group that Dick Tierlink was leading.
Okay.
And that really got me connected in a big way, particularly with the church's work on climate change, and so then I just started building more and more of a community there, of folks who were, I think, going through the same kind of grappling process that I was in 2007 and 2008 of kind of how we come to terms with where we're at with the climate crisis, mm-hmm. and what is our moral responsibility to do something about it.
Mm-hmm. You were at the university at the time? What were you studying? What were the courses you were taking around that time?
Well, I was studying economics at the University of Utah, and they have a pretty enlightened economics program there, as economics programs go in this country, and so there was overlap there. People like Hans Ehrbar who was a professor of economics there. He was also involved with the Unitarian Church in a lot of their events, and a lot of the climate justice community there in Utah. And so there was a lot of overlap in those spheres. I was involved in some student groups at the U, particularly SEED, which was an environmental group, and Joan Gregory started getting involved pretty heavily in that organization, and she was often showing up to our meetings on campus, and we were holding joint events then with the environmental ministry and the student group at the Unitarian Church. And so there was just a lot of overlap and kind of cross-pollination between the worlds that I was in there in the university and at the Unitarian Church.
Okay. And just a quick recap of going to the auction, a little background on that.
Yeah, so the environmental ministry there at First U also played a big role in kind of getting me into the position that I was in when I disrupted that auction. I was in dialogue with a lot of folks there at First U about how I was recognizing that we needed more confrontational approaches in the environmental movement, that we needed some civil disobedience in the climate movement, and folks there said pretty clearly, we'll support you if you find something to do. And one of the turning points for me was this speech that Naomi Klein gave at Bioneers in 2008, where she said, look at Obama's climate plan, which is clearly not good enough to address the climate crisis. It's not good enough to preserve civilization. And so, his power comes from being a centrist. And so if where the center is at is not good enough to save our civilization from climate change, then our job is to move the center. And there were a lot of us who saw that speech and really resonated with it. And so then the environmental ministry hosted an event at First Church where we played that speech, and then we had a lot of discussions about what does it mean to move the center. And so it was out of that discussion where it became clear to me that you can't move the center from the center. If you want to move the center, you have to go to the edge and push the boundaries and tilt the balance. And so it was, and then I remember in closing that event, Joan said, "I want you to write down what you're ready to do." And it was that moment of commitment, and that's when I said, "Okay, I'm ready to do this." And that was in November of 2008. And so then it was just a few weeks later that this auction was happening at the very end of the Bush administration, kind of the last big attempt to get public lands in the hands of the oil and gas industry. And they were auctioning off lands right outside of Arches and Canyonlands National Park, so it was a pretty hot button issue at the time. And so I went there with that sort of vague commitment that I had made at that event that night, where I said, I'm ready to do something powerful here, but still not knowing what that was, and walked in and ended up seeing the opportunity to take powerful action by bidding and outbidding the oil companies. And so that's what I did, and it became a big story that has continued to shape my life ever since.
Absolutely, yeah. You wound up with a legal team with Pat Shea.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Actually, Pat Shea reached out to us shortly after the auction. There was a website that we had scraped together with the help of Michael Milkey and Cliff Lyon that he was working with, and so we had a Bidder 70 website that was up within, I think, 24 hours after the auction. Ooh, wow. And so people were posting comments on there, and Pat Shea posted on there and said, if you need a lawyer and a former director of the BLM, give me a call, and had a phone number on there. And I was like, yeah, whatever, probably some kook or something. And then Cliff, who ran their website, said, no, I think this guy's legit, you should give him a call. And so I ended up calling him and sitting down with him, and we connected in a lot of ways. And so so he started representing me right after that, and kind of appointed himself to be my consigliere or advisor or mentor or whatever, and was very involved in a lot of the stuff that I was doing my whole time there in Salt Lake after that.
How did the legal strategy, was there a difference between legal strategies between what you wanted to do and what Pat wanted to do?
There was somewhat. Both Pat and my other defense attorneys, Ron Yangich and Liz Hunt, as defense attorneys, their job is to minimize the harm to their client. And they took that role very seriously. And my job as an activist was to maximize my impact, and so there was sometimes tension between those two goals. And in particular, Pat really felt like I could be more powerful as an organizer on the outside than being a political prisoner on the inside. And I was reluctant to take the plea bargains that were offered to me that would have avoided that prison time, for a lot of reasons, both to do with the movement and to do with my beliefs about the role of a jury and that sort of thing. And so there were lots of debates about that. And Pat was constantly pushing me in the whole time that I was working with Peaceful Uprising before the trial, to stay out of trouble, to not get arrested again, and all that kind of stuff. And I knew that was good advice, and I walked a fine line of taking just enough of it. So yeah, he was constantly kind of trying to steer me and protect me during that time.
Peaceful Uprising. You started the Peaceful Uprising? You joined it? What was it?
Yeah, so it started shortly after the auction, with folks who kind of resonated with that kind of action and people who wanted to see more of the same. And it actually grew out of First Church. That's where our first meetings were held. Sort of the kickoff event that launched Peaceful Uprising was in January of 2009, where I spoke there at the church, and Tom spoke, and Rocky Anderson spoke. and so it was out of that that we formed this organization that then spun off from the church, but continued to work pretty closely with the environmental ministry. And so folks like Joan Gregory and Kathy Albury were pretty central to Peaceful Uprising during its whole time.
Oh, okay. At the sentencing, you delivered a 45-minute lecture to the judge. How did that fit in between the two strategies, or whose idea was it? How did that develop?
Well, the speech that I gave in my sentencing was sort of what had been building up in me throughout the whole legal process, where what I was allowed to say had been very restricted. And, I wasn't allowed to talk about climate change during the trial. I wasn't allowed to talk about my motivations. And so, I had respected those limitations that were put on my defense. And that was part of the tension there with my lawyers. They really insisted that I follow those rules that were set by the judge. And so at my sentencing was the first chance that I had to speak openly. And so I, really insisted at that point with my legal team that I was going to speak openly and talk about sort of the full picture of what was going on in this trial and in the larger picture of where I felt like we were at that point with our government, with what is termed the rule of law, which is, I think, a misnomer in this country, and where we're at with the climate crisis. So yeah, I took that opportunity, and my lawyers didn't know what I was going to say until a day or two before the trial, or I mean a day or two before the sentencing, and so they were kind of taken aback when they saw it and realized that it was going to piss off the judge. Up until that time, the lawyers had always told me that the standard practice with these kinds of cases is that at the sentencing, they announce what the sentence is and then give a date 4 weeks, 6 weeks into the future where you're supposed to self-surrender. And, by that time they know where you're going to be landing, and so they have you go directly to that prison. And so I assumed that that's what was going to happen until a couple days beforehand when I was talking to my lawyers, and they said, unless you piss off the judge at the sentencing hearing. And I was like, well, this is what I'm going to say. And they were like, oh no, he's probably going to lock you up then. And so I gave that testimony there with the sentencing, and then the judge followed it up with about a half an hour speech of his own, expressing his own ideology, which was very much the antithesis of mine, and the part of that stuck with me was when he quoted Sir Thomas More in A Man for All Seasons, but he quoted from Act 1 in that play, which was before his conversion, his transformation, his enlightenment, when he was still just a stooge of the king, and he said, the law of man is all we have because we can't really know any higher law than that. And so it was before he had his sort of moral enlightenment, and the judge was quoting him as an authoritative source, which is kind of like quoting Saul before the road to Damascus, as your voice of moral justice.
Yeah. You weren't allowed to use the necessity defense. A lot of water has passed under since.
Yeah. Yeah, so the defense that I wanted to use was called the necessity defense, which would have allowed me to make the argument that I was acting out of necessity to prevent a greater harm, and really kind of put the reality of climate change into the court process then, and allow the jury to make a decision of whether or not the climate crisis was so severe and our government's response was so inadequate that there was a necessity to take this kind of action. And we weren't allowed to even touch that at all. But since then, lots of other folks have tried to make that defense, and we keep getting closer and closer. So there's been quite a few of those that I've been involved in. And I ended up starting an organization out here on the East Coast called the Climate Disobedience Center that works with other folks who are engaging in civil disobedience. And kind of where we specialize in is making that necessity defense argument. So we've worked with the folks who anchored a lobster boat off in front of a coal-fired power plant and blocked a shipment of West Virginia coal from being delivered. And they were about to make the necessity defense. They'd been given permission when their district attorney actually took over their case the day of the trial and then dropped all the charges and came outside to the crowd that we had gathered and announced that he was dropping the charges out of concern for all the children who would be impacted by climate change, and said that there's been a serious failure of political leadership on this that necessitates this kind of action. And we were stunned. I mean, you can imagine the prosecutor in my case coming out to all of the folks that we gathered there in Salt Lake City and saying, Tim was right. Like, but, it's shocking. And then out in Seattle, there were folks who blockaded a coal train and were making the necessity defense there. And they were actually able to present the evidence for necessity. And so they had experts on the stand, climate scientists who testified about the threats we're facing, oil safety experts who testified about the risk of transporting that oil through communities, and the defendants themselves, who all spoke about their own motivations. Mm-hmm. And then it was a little weird because the judge didn't allow the jury to rule on the necessity defense, so he didn't give the jury instructions, but at least they got the evidence out there. Mm-hmm. And so that was kind of a step forward. Then more recently, in 2016, one of my own acts of civil disobedience in Boston, where we blockaded the construction of a natural gas pipeline. There were a lot of ongoing resistance actions to that. Over 200 people arrested over the course of a couple of months, and so 13 of us took our case to trial, and we were being given the opportunity to use the necessity defense, but then the prosecution lowered the charges to an infraction, and so that meant we didn't have the right to a jury anymore, and so we just ended up making our case to the judge directly, and we had to make it really compressed, and it was only our own testimony. We couldn't have expert witnesses on there. But in that case, we actually won. The judge acquitted us by reason of necessity. And so that's the first case that we know of in the United States where a judge has acquitted climate activists by reason of necessity. So that seems like a big step forward. That just happened in the spring of this year. And now the next big opportunity is coming up in October in Minnesota. There's folks there that are called the valve turners that turn the emergency shutoff valves on the tar sands pipelines carrying tar sands from Canada into the U.S. And they did that back in October of 2016. And so they've been going through the legal process ever since then. And so they've been given permission to use the necessity defense. The state appealed that twice. It went to the state Supreme Court, which ruled that they do have the right to use the necessity defense. And so that'll be really the first opportunity that we've seen to present a full necessity defense to a jury with the whole arguments. And it's a high stakes case. They're being charged with felonies. Other folks who did the same thing served a decent amount of time in prison. So that's really a high stakes trial where, now 10 years after I disrupted the auction, we're finally going to be able to see that kind of trial, and a jury of 12 random people is going to have the opportunity to rule on that kind of case.
So you spent a couple years in prison. In your civil disobedience groups and associations, do you have many people going to prison? Pretty rare.
Not very often. Earlier this year, one of the other valve turners, as I said, in Montana, Leonard Higgins, or actually Leonard Higgins avoided prison time, but one of the other valve turners in North Dakota, Michael Foster, ended up going to prison. He got sentenced to a year, but that was in state court, so he ended up serving about half that time. He served about 6 months and just got released recently. And that's kind of unusual to do that amount of time. But what we're seeing right now is a real escalation and crackdown on civil disobedience across the country as more and more of the climate movement has turned to really powerful civil disobedience of the type that we saw at Standing Rock and really mass participation. We've seen a lot of backlash and laws being passed at the state level that allow for much more draconian punishment just for being on the property where they're building a pipeline or something like that. And so right now in Louisiana is sort of the front line of that, where folks down there are fighting the Bayou Bridge pipeline, which is the other end of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And just over the past few weeks, we've seen the first uses of this, what they're calling critical infrastructure anti-protest laws, because that law just went into effect August 1st in Louisiana. So already 7 people down there have been arrested and charged with felonies just for their views against the pipeline and for being in the general area. And those folks face up to 20 years with that draconian new law. And those laws are being pushed by ALEC in states around the country. So it's really a major threat to activists right now. And I think there'll be some really important test cases over the next couple of years to decide whether or not these laws are constitutional.
Okay. Your time in prison, what would you say the highs and lows of that were? You have a chance to do a lot of reading, a lot of writing. Did you in fact?
Yeah, I definitely did a lot of reading. I didn't do a lot of writing. I expected to and did when I first got in, but after a while I started to feel kind of detached from the community that I felt like I was writing for. So yeah, I pretty much stopped writing early on. But I did a lot of reading and had a lot of visits and a lot of support. I was getting 8 or 10 letters a day from my community there in Utah and from people around the country, and particularly from UU churches. When the Bitter 70 film started circulating, a lot of UU churches were screening that film, and so I was getting a lot of letters from UUs around the country. And so that really that was one of the highlights, was having that sense of connection, having the visits. A lot of people came out both to California and Colorado to visit me when I was locked up, and that really made a huge difference, having that support. But it also was an opportunity for me over those couple of years to connect in a really deep way with a segment of society that I hadn't spent a lot of time with. And so there was a lot of stuff that going in I knew in my head intellectually. Like I had read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander before I got locked up. So I could cite those statistics about how unjust our system of mass incarceration is. But when I was really living it with these people for 2 years and hearing their stories day in and day out, it really helped me internalize all of that at a much deeper level, and so I think it deepened a lot of my social justice commitments during that time.
I've been in Toastmasters for years, and so a lot of speech giving, a lot of speech writing, a lot of speech critiquing, and so where did where did your speechifying, or where did your speech techniques take a step up?
That's a good question, because I had never really given any public talks before I disrupted the auction. And so I think the first one was actually at First U, at that event in January of 2009. And there were parts of it that felt really natural to me. I've never been one to speak from a script. There have been sometimes more recently when I've been preaching about something really specific and I wanted to get certain points across that I preach from a script, but generally I'm almost always just sort of speaking from the heart or from something deeper, and I really feel like I get into a flow and into a dialogue with an audience that has always felt really, really natural to me, which is weird because I'm a very introverted person. And so I think there's something about public speaking where no one's going to interrupt me that I really appreciate and can sort of express a full thought. And so yeah, I felt pretty naturally into that. And I've certainly picked up some pointers along the way, but have never had any formal training except when I was in seminary at Harvard Divinity School. I took some preaching classes and some homiletics classes there.
Tell a little bit about the Harvard Divinity stint.
Yeah, so it was kind of shortly before I went to prison that I started thinking about divinity school. Okay. And that came about for a couple of reasons. One, it came about because I was seeing the role of the climate movement shift a little bit by that point in 2011, where I felt like our job was no longer primarily about reducing emissions, but it was becoming at least as much about figuring out how we maintain our humanity as we navigate this path of chaotic change that is now largely inevitable. And looking around the climate movement at that time, I felt like we didn't have any of the tools and skills to even begin that conversation about how people hold on to hope in desperate times or hold on to their values in times of struggle. But I saw that religious traditions did have a set of tools and skills for that I felt like we really needed to learn from. But I also looked at it from sort of a career perspective and looked at the things that I was realizing I was good at as an activist when I sort of stumbled into this role of public leadership, and looking around the other professionals in the climate movement working for NGOs, I said, none of their jobs are doing what I feel like I'm good at in this role. And so I said, where is somebody who's doing this kind of public leadership of expressing values and, keeping a big picture vision in mind for a community? And then I was like, oh, that's what Tom does. And that was kind of surprising to me, to think like, oh, maybe what I'm doing is a kind of ministry here, and these skills that I'm suited for is a kind of ministry. And so that's kind of what pushed me towards getting serious about divinity school. And so, I ended up going there shortly after I got released from prison. I actually got accepted to Harvard Divinity School. I was still incarcerated. So shortly afterwards, I moved out to Cambridge. And it was a pretty shocking transition to go from prison to Harvard, where the phrase "on the yard" meant something very different. So, yeah, it was a rough adjustment for me, and it was a rough adjustment to Unitarian Universalism on the East Coast and in Boston, which was very different than the Unitarian Universalism that I had been exposed to in Utah. I became a Unitarian in Salt Lake, and saw that there in the UU Mecca of Boston, it was a very different religion than it is in the Mormon Mecca in Utah, where I feel like UUs in Utah understand that if you care about values, you stand up and you fight for them, and you stand together with all the other people who are threatened, because you're going to need them. And there was a lot of comfort that I experienced in UUs in Boston, in the East Coast, and people took a lot for granted, and I felt like that was reflected in the religious community then, that spoke with much less of a prophetic voice, much less of an activist voice, and there was much more talk about being a sanctuary from our busy lives, and rather than lots of sermons about how we stand up for what's right in the world, lots of sermons about the need to take a quiet moment and look out the window and listen to the birds from our busy lives, and so it was a big adjustment for me, and really made me reconsider my career path then, and so after a couple years in seminary, I realized that being a UU minister was not for me, and so since then I've continued to explore lots of other options.
Okay. Just a couple questions, I guess, about civil disobedience strategy. It seems to me that this climate change thing is really a supply and demand issue, and that you seem to be more attacking the supply side rather than people wanting to use fossil fuels.
Mm-hmm.
Is there
Yeah.
is there pros and cons to doing the supply demand focus?
Sure. That's a big discussion in the climate change world, and I think historically most of the efforts have gone into the demand side, and that's part of why I ended up working on the supply side, just because things were so out of balance. And at the time that I got involved in the climate struggle in 2007, every list of 10 things you can do about climate change was all consumer oriented. It was all changing your consumer habits. The only message that people were getting from the climate movement was, you're an individual consumer. That's your role. There was nothing about how you are a citizen of what was once a democracy. You are a community member. You are all these different roles, and you have the power to shape those options that are given to you, not just to choose from those options. And so to me, that's always been the heart of activism, is about creating more possibilities, and also coming into it as someone who was studying economics at the time. I saw that those theoretical models about supply and demand don't really exist anywhere in our modern economy, but particularly don't exist in the fossil fuel economy, where the fossil fuel industry is one of the biggest lobbying forces in our government, that really controls both parties and has the power to shape the market to their own demands, and to create the demand. So what I saw was that in that supply and demand for fossil fuels, the demand was not an independent factor, that the suppliers had the ability to structure society to manufacture demand, and that the suppliers were really the independent agents. That's where you had the moneyed powers that controlled political offices, that could make whatever choices they wanted, And so if we wanted to influence the system, we had to go to where people were making free choices. And by and large, most consumers in our society, particularly when it comes to fossil fuels, are not really making free choices. Their choices are being incredibly constricted by the forces that are shaping that system that they're in.
Could you suggest any books on just that topic? I guess I haven't heard that side of it.
One would be The Value of Nothing by Raj Patel.
Okay.
That he's an economist that kind of looks at it, looks at how our economy is really working in a functional way. Lots of books about corporate personhood would be applicable to this, and about the increasing role that corporations have been playing in controlling our government. That's a huge factor.
Okay. Another point I was wondering about was there doesn't seem to be much talk about the apocalypse coming up. The rationale for that?
Well, it depends on who you ask as to whether or not there's much talk about the apocalypse. Some would say there's too much.
Oh.
One of the ongoing debates in the climate world, particularly over the past 3 or 4 years, has been basically how much truth to share with people, and what's effective in terms of messaging, and whether or not it's okay to scare people. And there's a lot of folks who say that we shouldn't be scaring people too much, that we shouldn't tell them how bad things really are, that we have to sort of manage people's fear, and manage people's emotional experience of the climate crisis, because they can't really handle the full scope of it. And I'm definitely on the side that says people need the full truth, and that despair is not the end of the road. So one of the things that is kind of a mantra among those who say we shouldn't be giving people too much truth is that we will scare people into paralysis. That it's a notion that sort of once people hear this apocalyptic notion of where we're headed, that they just shut down, curl into a ball, and then we'll never do anything again. And some of that actually comes from the studies of climate communication that are done in a university setting or something like that, where they'll bring in volunteers, random people, and give them one or two messaging, and then give them a survey that says how motivated are you to act on climate change, and the people that are shell-shocked by apocalyptic bad news, 10 minutes later when they're taking the survey, they're like, I don't know what to do, I don't want to do anything. And so those studies come out with conclusions that say that too much bad news is demotivating for people, and we have to keep things positive to motivate people to take action, because they check on a survey, oh yeah, I'd be more likely to change my light bulbs because of this positive news about the economic benefit of renewable energy. But that's all within this very contained time frame within an academic study, that it doesn't actually follow the real life experience of people that are actually doing something about climate change. And pretty much everyone that I know that is dedicating their lives to fighting the climate crisis, whether that's as an activist or as a scientist or a researcher or a journalist, they've all had those moments of despair. They've all had times, not just a few minutes, but sometimes weeks or months or a year of sitting in that dark time of thinking this is hopeless, I don't know what to do, I don't feel like doing anything. But that's not the end of the line. They come through it. And a lot of times we go through that process several times. We might be deep in despair for a month, 1 year, and then, be taking a lot of action, and then 2 years later, have another few weeks of despair, or another 6 months of despair, or whatever.
Okay.
But, people can handle it in their own ways. And so I think we need to trust that people are stronger than we give them credit for.
Finally, any advice for young people, and would it differ between high school kids, college kids, and adults, how to get involved in civil disobedience or the climate change movement?
That's the question of how young people can get involved is one that's rapidly evolving. And when I first got involved in the climate struggle, I considered myself a young person. Other people considered me a young person, and I was able to have that sort of youthful perspective about how we're the generation that is most impacted by this, and now I'm not a young person anymore. I'm a middle-aged person, and and so I'm sort of a different generation than some of the youth activists that are stepping up now, in very different ways, and frankly, I've been surprised by that generation that is younger than me, by the way that they've responded to climate change. I think a lot of my generation had a lot more anger and resentment about how the generations before us have left us with this broken world, and I really expected the people who are younger than me to have even more anger and resentment, because they certainly had justification for it. But really, I haven't seen that. Even when I've worked with that age range, and tried to make space for that, and open up that for them to share, I just haven't seen that as part of their authentic reaction to this, which I could come up with a lot of theories for, but I think they're in a different place and experiencing this crisis in a different way, just as my generation is experiencing it in a different way from the baby boomers, and so I think bringing all those different perspectives together is pretty important to coming up with the holistic picture of the nature of this crisis and how we need to be responding to it. But I think the big difference with young people today is that it's far more clear that a major part of their response to the climate crisis is going to have to be resilience and adaptation, and dealing with the impacts of climate change. There's less language now about stopping the climate crisis, and more about climate justice, which includes ways of sharing the hardships and the inevitable burdens of the climate crisis, sharing those in equitable and just ways across different populations, and so I think that's an important perspective that the young people are bringing to this movement.